Lester, Wushu engineer. Today what I'd like to talk about is in particular brick breaking. We're going to do a few experiments and see how much force it takes to break a brick. But of course the question, how much force does it take to break a brick, is really a little bit like the question, how long is a piece of string? Because there are many different types of bricks, and breaking various objects has been a staple of traditional martial arts for quite a long time. And even some modern martial arts, where practitioners test or prove their striking effectiveness and efficiency and power by breaking various objects, whether it's wood or bricks or a host of other materials. And of course, what we have to consider when someone is breaking something for demonstration purposes, that person is most likely going to try to give the appearance of doing the best that they possibly can. So if for instance you have a pile of bricks in your backyard, you have on the one side you have a pile of reasonably soft bricks, and you have on the other pile in the other pile you have some harder bricks. The average person out there doesn't know the difference between the two. So if that person wants to do a really convincing demonstration, they might break a pile of softer bricks as opposed to perhaps one harder brick. And that's just the nature of showing off. Essentially, you'll always try and do the best performance that you possibly can. And of course, one of the things that I'm trying to get at in this video is the ignorance out there as to the level of difficulty of some of these demonstrations. And I will state that breaking any object does require skill, and it requires quite a lot of understanding about how to manipulate forces through your body. So I'm not saying that anyone out there breaking bricks is essentially tricking you. They're not. There is some real skill and power involved. But of course, the relative amount of that skill and power does change depending on what they're doing. So I have a range of objects here, bricks mostly, that I've broken over the years, just to show you the increasing level of difficulty. So the first that I have to display here is a concrete, essentially like a type of concrete paver or capstone for a blockwork wall. This is reasonably easy to break. It still does require skill and power, but it's certainly the easiest to break in the list of or the group of objects that I have here, for a number of reasons. But probably the prime reason is that this is made of concrete with no reinforcing in it. It's not fired, it's just concrete. And with these kind of capstones, even if you drop them on the ground, they can actually sometimes fracture. So, and you'll also notice that on some of the demonstration videos, people breaking concrete tiles like this often break something which is even easier to break than this, which is a garden edging, a concrete garden edging, which is actually narrower than this and has not crenellations but bumps on the one side, decorative features, which actually introduce points of weakness in the structure. So that is considerably easier to break than this, which is considerably easier to break than any of the other objects here. So next we have the first of the hard-fired clay pavers. It's hard-fired, so it's not crumbly at all, but it's also quite thin. Its profile is quite small. So this is harder to break than the concrete paver, but it's still easier than the others. So next we have another hard-fired concrete, hard-fired clay paver. This, as you can see, is a bit wider, but you'll also notice that the grain in the brick, even though it's hard-fired, the grain is quite a lot coarser, and this means that it doesn't require quite as much force to break than some of the others. The next brick is roughly the same kind of cross-sectional area, but you'll notice that the grain is much smaller, and this is possibly this brick and this one here, which has a coarser grain but is wider. These are about at the limit of what my potential is to break bricks at the moment. These are quite difficult to break. Just as a matter of interest, I also have in this bunch of objects a file which I broke with a strike. This is also fairly difficult to break, but because it's very hard steel, it's got a very high temper to it. Or I should say, it's very much a hardened steel, and the file indentations in it actually set up points of weakness. So if you strike it just right, you can catastrophically compromise its structure. You could break it, but still quite difficult. So that's just a brief overview of some of the bricks, just to give you an idea that, well, they're bricks and they're bricks. So when you see someone breaking stacks of things, you have to ask the question, what are those things, and what is their structural integrity, and how much force and skill is this person demonstrating over someone else who might be breaking something which looks a lot smaller, but might actually require quite a lot more force and skill in order to break. So I've set up a brick on the load cell, and it's a mid-range hard-fired clay paver, fairly coarse grained but still quite hard-fired, and I've got a telephone directory on it because I like to save my hands, and I'm going to start up the software, see how much force it takes to break the brick, and then I will put the PowerKube on the load cell for those who use the PowerKube device, and I'll try and mimic the same amount of force from the load cell, and then there's some form of comparison between values that you might be achieving on the PowerKube and Franklin's and the loads and what you get from the load cell. Obviously they are not putting out the same, there's no direct comparison between the two, as I've indicated in a previous video, but just for interest's sake. Okay. I'll just zero the software, start the software running, and we'll see what happens. So, we'll stop that software. And according to that software, that was 1,200 newtons of force. I'll get another one, and we'll try the same experiment. So I'll just stop this recording, and we'll make a record of that. Zero it, start. brake. And I'll stop it there. And that was 1254 newtons. So I'll just stop the recording just to make a record of that. Just start the software. 0, start. Broke. It was a lot harder than the other two, and we should be able to see that from the so that's really interesting. I'll discuss that a little bit later. Okay, so now I have the PowerKube set up on the load cell. I'm going to try to do the same strike, and we'll see what kind of values we can get from the two different devices to try to extrapolate a value from the PowerKube that would be required in order to break the bricks that I've just been breaking. Just start the software. Okay, so start. PowerKube software is running. Okay, so I'll do a few more strikes. Okay, so they're all roughly in the right kind of ballpark. We'll stop that, and then we can compare those values. So that was really quite interesting, especially the last brick that I broke. So I did the brick break 3 times. The third brick I failed on the first 2 attempts and succeeded on the 3rd attempt. Now, the first 2 bricks that I broke, they both broke at about just over 1200 newtons, so 1275 on the first brick and 1254 newtons on the second brick. The third brick that I failed twice at breaking, the first 2 attempts that were both fails were over 2100 newtons of force. So the first strike 2150 newtons and the second strike 2142 newtons, and surprisingly enough the strike that broke the brick came in at 1306 newtons, although I suppose it's not really that surprising. If you've ever for those of you who have actually tried object breaking using strikes, you'll know that if you don't get it right, it hurts quite a bit. And that's obviously the potentially the reaction force that you're feeling against the object as you providing your peak force. It's also reacting back, and if it is not breaking in that attempt and absorbing some of the energy of that strike of yours, that energy has to go somewhere, and part of it is reflected back into you, and that's what you can potentially feel as either pain or damage. So it's always best to break the brick on the first go, rather than striking and failing. But it opens an interesting question, which is, were the first 2 strikes that weakened the structural integrity of the brick, and then the 3rd strike broke it, or were they just strikes that I didn't manipulate the force properly as I was performing them? Did I just not manipulate the force properly? Because it's not just a simple matter of smacking the brick until it breaks. There is quite a bit of subtlety involved in how you actually manipulate the force into the object to achieve the maximum possible results. So I can't really answer that question just yet. I tend to lean towards the conclusion that the first two strikes did not actually weaken the structural integrity of the brick, but that they were strikes that were slightly off, that I didn't get quite right, and the third strike was the third time lucky. The third strike was the one that was performed properly and actually broke it. And a lot of that has to do with how you or how the breaker actually achieves a apparent mass behind that strike to kind of essentially cause the maximum effect with that force as they're pushing it into the object. But I think there's enough material there in terms of studies for quite a few other videos at a later date. I can't answer with 100% certainty on that, but just a very interesting result that the first two failures were both nearly twice as much force in them as the strike that broke it. In terms of the load cell comparison with the PowerKube, all four of the strikes that are performed were all in the right ballpark in terms of the amount of force measured on the load cell. Unfortunately, I forgot to actually record the first three strikes, the actual force values, but I know from memory that they were all in the range 1200 to 1400 newtons, so in the right ballpark. The last figures that I did actually record, the last force output from the load cell that I did record was 1413 newtons, and that corresponded with an output from the PowerKube of 17687 franklins. The other three values you can no doubt pick up from the video, but they were 16688 franklins, 16317 franklins, and 14758 franklins. And that third strike I might just have not gotten it quite accurately enough, because it has to be struck exactly in the center of the PowerKube in order to achieve the maximum result. So that's really just for those folk out there who'd like a bit of a comparison, who might be working on the PowerKube themselves or have interest in the PowerKube device. Those are the numbers that correspond roughly with the kind of forces that I'm producing in order to break the bricks that I broke today. So I hope you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comments section below whether there's anything else you'd like me to investigate as far as object breaking is concerned. Thanks. This has been Lester, Wushu Engineer.